On Grady Hill by Brent Noury. Read by Brent Noury. Chapter 10. The Train to Utopia. I had been sitting with Mrs. Antono just long enough for her to pull out most of Jem's letters and his journal about his adventures working his way up to our town and becoming friends with Big Bill and the Clarks. After Mrs. Antono's passing, Samuel and I were left with a whole chest of Jem's writings that I keep in that closet over there. I keep telling myself one day I'm going to force Bradley Samuel to dig into them pages and turn me out a novel about poor Jem. Bradley Samuel or our young writer Miss Evangeline could take a crack at it. She's writing more than Bradley these days anyhow. Well, as I was sitting with Mrs. Antono, Samuel arrived with Titus and Miss Adelaide Gentry. We greeted them on Mrs. Antono's front porch. The Antonos had lived on that part of Clark's since before I was born, basically since Jem came to town and met Mrs. Madeline Antono, formerly Miss Madeline Gentry. Mrs. Antono was aunt to Miss Adelaide, and the eldest daughter of Mr. Gentry. While Titus began to describe the layout for what would become Mrs. Antono's land and the start of the Flower Brook Trail along the railroad, Samuel took me aside and told me what happened over at Gentry's. Samuel had made a deal with Gentry. He had convinced Walt Gentry to finally sell hospitality to Mr. Anglo. Then, due to Mr. Gentry caring for his daughter and all her hardship she was going through, Samuel had told Walt he could get a chunk of land leading into Haven Street from Clark's, and that Mrs. Antono could have that whole area where she lived. But Samuel told Walt he needed the railroad to run through that part of Clark's and lead into town along Haven. In exchange, Samuel would give up all of Backside Farm to Gentry Ford. Mr. Gentry said he never wanted that railroad going near Charleston's anyhow, and if Samuel could convince Clark to sell that piece of land to him, then they all had a deal. Titus and Miss Adelaide stayed behind with Mrs. Antono as Samuel and I made our way up the long, overgrown path towards the Clark house. The land hadn't been tended in years. No one had seen Andy Clark leave the house in a long time. The only sign that anyone lived there was the rye fields closest to the house had been harvested last autumn. As we approached the front steps, Samuel turned and said, "Don't worry, Andy's good company." Samuel opened the front door, and we went in on our own. The house was filled with the smell of tobacco and liquor and something else that's not quite describable. There were piles of boxes and papers and barrels and bottles everywhere. We made our way through a narrow path towards the back of the house. Then we heard the strumming of a banjo through the back screen door. I remembered that Jem Antono had often gone to the Clark house and played his violin with Andy Clark. Sometimes on a perfectly clear night, you could hear them playing from South Haven, like if you were visiting Mrs. Anglo at hospitality. Mrs. Candace would laugh and say, "Them boys are going to blow themselves up one night." Samuel and I stepped out through the back door towards the banjo playing, and there, sitting in the backyard with a banjo in hand next to the largest contraption distillery I've ever seen, smoking a pipe with shoulder-length stringy hair and long beard, was Andy Clark, laughing away as he glanced up and saw "Some mountain gray wolf. Andy down moonshine." The two old friends embraced and talked about old times for a bit. I was introduced to Andy as well as a sip of shine, and for the next 2 hours, Andy explained every element of the distillery process. At the same time, Samuel would tell Andy of the railroad plan. By the time both processes were completely explained to each other, Andy was on board the train to Utopia. The land deal was settled. Andy sat back in glee with the thought of taking Winston Charleston's train. We headed back down the path towards Mrs. Ontino's, where we picked up Titus and Miss Adelaide again. As the four of us reached Haven Street, Mr. and Mrs. Anglo were waiting for us at Hospitality Manor, and the six of us made our way up Haven towards McQuarrell Tavern, where my daddy and the Northside boys would be. Little did we know it, but we were all starting to believe in the trick up Samuel's sleeve. The pieces were coming together, and the mountain of dreams was in the palm of Samuel Grady's hand. As we approached the tavern, Samuel told all of us to go inside and not make mention of the plan, but that he'll be back with a message in half an hour. Titus asked Samuel where he was going. Samuel responded, "I'm going to talk with Winston Charleston." End of chapter 10.